On April 26, the White House introduced a tax plan for lowering rates and simplifying the tax code. These changes, however, included eliminating a number of tax incentives, including the state and local deduction and a near doubling of the standard deduction. Realtors voiced concerns over the effect that this plan would have on current home buyers as well as prospective buyers. So joining me to talk a little bit more about this is Evan Lydiard, Senior Policy Representative for NAR Government Affairs, as well as Jamie Gregory, our Deputy Chief Lobbyist. So, Evan, jumping right into this, lowering rates, doubling the standard deduction, it sounds like there could be some things in there that are wins for a middle-class household. Why are realtors concerned?
Well, John, everybody loves tax cuts, and it sounds like this plan is going to give everybody one, but unfortunately that's not the case. We have three basic problems with this particular plan. First, it discriminates against homeowners. People who own a home are much more likely to have a tax increase than a renter is. And I don't want to make it sound like everybody who owns a home is going to get a tax increase, but millions of households would.
Okay, so a big number.
Very, very big number. Second, by greatly increasing the standard deduction and eliminating the state and local tax deduction, the tax incentive from moving from renting to owning would largely disappear for all but 5% of the taxpayers. When we have we're near the all-time low for home ownership rates and first-time homebuyer numbers. This is no time to throw these into the ditch by making this worse. Finally, we believe that this plan would cause home values to drop across the board by more than 10%. This would cause millions of homeowners to go negative with their equity or go underwater with their mortgage. And that's a terrible time for this to happen as well for the economy.
And what about personal exemptions? Is that something that people need to be concerned about?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because part of the complexity of this and why it may sound like everybody is getting a tax cut is because we all talk about the doubling of the standard deduction. In reality, it's not really doubling at all. Instead, it's replacing the personal exemption for a taxpayer and his or her spouse, and the dependency exemption is also being rolled into a new higher child credit that not everybody gets. Add that to some rate changes, and this is why not everybody is going to be ending up getting a tax cut when it sounds like they might.
And what about in high-cost areas? Does this have anything to do with the state and local tax deduction, or are there areas where people need to be more concerned about the elimination of the state and local deduction?
Well, that more than 10% figure I mentioned about price values going down, it'll be even higher in areas that are high cost, and we believe that's because of the higher cost of property taxes and state taxes. The effect is exacerbated in areas with that higher cost of taxes, of losing that state and local tax deduction.
Now, Evan, I know the plan also cuts the corporate tax rate to 15%, or at least it proposes to do so. What would the net effect be for a real estate professional? Could they see some potential benefit there?
Well, first, that's an aspirational number. It's a good goal to have, but the idea of extending that to every single person in business for himself or herself is going to be problematic. First, it could cost trillions of dollars to the Treasury. And second, there are some technical problems that would give huge incentives for you and me and everybody else that works for a living to try to incorporate themselves into a limited liability company or some other kind of partnership so we can get 15% tax rate for our income as well.
Meaning, as it stands, a lot of people might not benefit from it now without making some changes to how they're structured.
Well, there's going to be a lot of discussion about that before we see a 15% rate for pass-through entities, and I'm quite skeptical it'll get that low.
Jamie, this is probably a better question for you, but what are the prospects that this plan, or even parts of it, really become law in the end?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think one thing we can do is look at history. The last time this was proposed was 30 years ago in 1986, the Comprehensive Tax Plan when Ronald Reagan was president. Things were very different. You had a Republican president, you had a Republican Senate, you had a Democratic House, so they were forced to be bipartisan. And Ronald Reagan, Dan Rostenkowski, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Packwood of the Finance Committee, a Democrat and a Republican, they all held hands, they all worked together. But let's look at exactly what happened. The first time that President Reagan mentioned tax reform was the 1984 State of the Union address, which was January of 1984. He ultimately didn't sign a bill until October 22nd, 1986, so a little short of 3 years later. So a significant amount of time. Also, when the process started, he had a 58% approval rating. He won re-election, largest electoral college margin in history, 525 to 13. His approval rating went to 60%, ultimately hit 68% in May of 1986, where they were in the heart of the final negotiations. And as I mentioned, he signed the bill in October. So this is a very different atmosphere here. It's much more partisan, and you don't have a president being able to drive the debate in the same way. Now, obviously, other ways, but not the same way that Ronald Reagan did. So I think it's to be determined how this plays out.
Well, Jamie, Evan, thank you both for doing this, and thank you for joining us. We're at the beginning of these conversations. There's a lot more coming down the road, so as updates are available or news is breaking, NAR is going to have it available. Visit nar.realtor. Keep watching, and thanks for joining.